rain-dark tracks beside the port. One freight signal lamp is already telling a train to prepare to stop. Not at the next signal, but at the one after that. This is the Night Almanac, your home in the dark, with nothing to do and nowhere to be. Tonight you drift far out, past the room, past the city, to where the world goes quiet, and home by morning. Sleep whenever you like. Under the Canadian Rail operating rules, that order is called advance clear to stop. The second signal ahead is the one the train must be ready for. Rain touches the bedroom glass while the house completes its smaller sounds. Your weight stays where the mattress has gathered it. Beyond the curtain, distant railway lights hold their place through the weather. The instruction belongs out there, beside wet steel, while the blanket keeps the last warmth of the room. The curtain rests against the sill. Past it, the dark railway has already begun. The Port of Vancouver lies beyond the sleeping streets, close enough for its fixed lamps to appear as fine points in the rain. Roofs and road surfaces pass beneath you without detail. At the water's edge, parallel rails take over from the scattered city light. Their wet upper faces carry thin reflections into the first cool corridor beside the harbor. Near the freight tracks, one signal housing stands above dark wagons and open stretches of rail. Water beads along its metal hood. The lens keeps its color, while the polished steel below gathers a narrow reflection, and the freight rolls past the fixed post. You drift level with the freight line as it leaves the nearest streets. Low sheds and wet ballast pass beside the wagons. The port lights thin behind the moving consist. Ahead, round lenses occupy different heights on a single mast, each enclosed by a dark hood against the rain. Canadian block and interlocking aspects can be formed through color, lamp position, flashing, or combinations of those visual properties. Several lenses can therefore share one mast while contributing to a single instruction. The freight closes on the stacked housings, their colored points kept separate over the wet steel. Under the Canadian rules, an arrow or plate attached to a signal can qualify or modify the meaning of its lights. The fitted shape belongs to the instruction rather than the mast around it. Beneath the stacked lenses, rain traces the rim of a narrow metal marker. The freight draws alongside, and the marker narrows against the passing post. It slips above the wagon roofs before disappearing into the rain. Another mast stands farther along the route, divided from the first by reflective rails and dark ballast. You travel with the steel line now, beyond the last soft rectangles of harbor glass. Water gathers in the shallow spaces among the ballast stones. Between the rails, narrow pools hold brief strips of signal light. The freight passes above them, leaving each reflection to close behind the last wagon. A harbor basin opens beside the railway. Gantry silhouettes stand across the water, while small lamps mark the distant shore. Reflections lengthen and divide with every ripple beneath the freight line. The attached marker recedes behind the passing wagons. Ahead, the track bends through low industrial ground where several rails begin to gather. Their polished upper surfaces carry thin bands of light toward a junction still partly hidden by the curve. The curve opens onto another dense signal group where a pale arrow begins flashing above the wet junction. A Canadian flashing direction indicator can tell the crew that the route at the next controlled location is already lined and secured in the arrow's direction. Beneath it, one rain-dark path bends away through the junction, its steel edges briefly silver where the pulse reaches them. The freight enters that bend without haste, each wagon taking the curve after the one before it. Couplers draw into shallow angles. The long sides pass the harbor buildings, and their graphite surfaces catch small window lights before giving them back to the rain. Moisture beads along a wagon sill, then loosens into the darkness beside the track. Beyond the last cluster of masts, the port spreads lower and wider. Container stacks stand in dark rows beside the line, divided by narrow lanes of wet pavement. Crane frames rise over them as open geometry, with the harbor held farther off in blue-black bands. You drift beside the wagons as the junction falls away. Their wheels remain below the long bodies, mostly hidden by shadow and spray. Between passing gaps, the water appears in narrow pieces, carrying broken reflections from the fixed shore lights. Farther inland, the rails separate from the harbor edge and pass between broad warehouse walls. Damp air softens the roof lines. A small signal stack waits at the end of that industrial corridor, its lamps held above polished steel. The freight approaches along one of several lines. The freight continues toward that distant post, carrying the junction's damp shine along the polished rail tops. Blue-white yard lights thin behind the final warehouse. Ahead, the mast grows clear against the low cloud, with one lamp burning above another, and the dark route extending beneath it into the next reach between buildings. A Canadian block, or interlocking indication, normally governs movement onward to the following signal. The fixed post slips behind the freight. Wet rails carry the train beneath a low warehouse bridge as the corridor lengthens inland. Past the bridge, warehouse walls fall away from a broad bed of dark ballast. Shallow water rests in hollows beside the sleepers, holding pale fragments from the industrial lights. A graphite fence follows the railway until the next curve opens. Harbor water remains between the buildings, a blue-black strip under low cloud. The head of the freight reaches open ground first. Its graphite nose passes the final close-set sheds and enters a wider band of night. You drift with that slow motion, carried past the last familiar rooflines. Farther on, the polished rails draw together at a curve beneath one small fixed light. Water moves quietly through a shallow channel beside the ballast. The steel above it holds a pale reflection from the industrial sky. The corridor bends beside a dark retaining wall, then opens onto another spread of railway ground. Empty sidings lie close to the main line, their rails dulled by weather. Low buildings gather beneath the cloud beyond them. The harbor glow has narrowed behind the freight, while inland darkness takes more of the horizon. At the far end of the bend, a steel signal bridge rises over the converging rails. Its housings resolve one by one through the rain, fixed above several possible paths. A cool lamp holds near the center of the span, and the freight continues toward it through the wide, industrial passage. The Canadian rail operating rules generally require a missing or imperfectly displayed fixed signal to be regarded as the most restrictive indication it can show. Rain beads across the deep hood of one dark housing, while the mast stands above the junction. The locomotive passes beneath the steelwork, carrying its long line away from the harbor sheds. Water streaks the graphite roof and gathers in shallow seams between panels. Above it, the fixed housings disappear behind the cab, leaving rain-dark track ahead. Container roofs pass beneath low cloud, their wet corrugations holding a narrow blue sheen. Farther inland, the rails separate across a broad junction before drawing close again. Some continue beside low freight sheds, others angle toward quiet storage tracks. The wagons keep to one path through the crossings, where polished steel edges catch brief, blue-white reflections beneath them. A narrow service road appears beyond the ballast, divided from the railway by a graphite fence. Puddles hold broken reflections from distant lamps. Road and rail run beside one another for a while. Then the fence turns toward a cluster of low utility buildings. You drift with the long curve now, farther from the bedside window that first held these lights. The harbor buildings flatten behind a veil of rain. A pale break in the cloud rests over the inland edge, beyond the roofs and container stacks. Past the utility buildings, low equipment cases begin to share the railway ground with the lamps. Branching rails lie beside cable runs and fenced enclosures, all extending into the first open reach beyond the port. A freight consist moves through their midst, its dark sides carrying small blue-white reflections toward the interior. A railway signal system reaches far beyond the lamps beside the track. Its working parts include train position detection, railway control, timetable operation, and points that choose routes. At the junction, wet switch rails narrow toward a single seam in the steel. The freight passes beyond the closest cluster of harbor tracks. You remain with its steady curve, carried through a belt of low buildings where the rails begin to lengthen. Rain softens the roof lines, while blue-white reflections travel along the dark sides of the wagons. Behind the wagons, the harbor glow thins beneath low cloud as the corridor opens inland. The coupled wagons carry a slow sequence of shadow and pale reflection through the low dark beyond the port. Their motion reaches you as a muted rise and fall, more felt than heard. The railway bends away from the water, carrying the room's last warmth farther into the night. Low cloud presses the city lights into a narrow band behind the moving consist. Nearer the ground, rain leaves a dull sheen on retaining walls and gravel shoulders. The rails continue inland through the dark margin, where the harbor's dense geometry begins to thin. Along the outer freight tracks, the close geometry of the junction begins to loosen. Sidings separate into rain, and low sheds stand back from the main line. You drift with the eastward curve as the port of Vancouver recedes beneath the weather. Farther on, the railway passes between broad industrial roofs and open strips of wet ground. The freight continues through that narrow band, its upper edges catching brief light beneath the cloud. Ahead, a raised embankment carries the line toward the first long reach beyond the coast. Rainwater slips beneath the raised grade through a corrugated steel culvert. Above it, the line leaves the last close-set warehouses and crosses a wider margin of wet ground. The harbor is still near, though its small lights have begun to gather behind the curve. You travel onward with the steel, farther from the window where this outward passage began. Transport Canada describes the Pacific Corridor as an integrated marine, rail, and road network, moving exports from Western Canada and the prairies. Near the coast, those three paths occupy the same broad reach of land. A vessel rests beside the terminals. Railway lines pass the stacked cargo, and wet roads thread between the larger shapes. Along the marine edge, the high side of a container vessel rises above the dark water. Its hull holds a muted strip of reflected cloud, while the shore slowly falls behind. The railway has found its inland direction now, carrying the night away from the cranes and low roofs gathered near the harbor. A wet roadway follows the railway briefly, divided from it by a narrow verge and low concrete barriers. Pale lamps pass across the pavement, then separate beneath a long viaduct. The tracks remain on their own curve beyond the columns. You move with that quiet divergence, held near the coast, but already turned toward the darker land beyond it. The last harbor lights fade behind the bend, scattered low beneath the mist. Covered freight wagons pass a long industrial fence where rain has darkened the metal panels. Their coupled outlines rise and fall slightly with the grade. Between the fence posts, brief openings reveal wet roofs and narrow service lanes, then close again as the line carries the consist beyond the outer buildings. The developed ground begins to open into longer intervals. One low roof stands apart from the others, followed by a broad strip of dark land and another band of railway. The coast remains beneath the cloud behind you. Ahead, the raised line runs toward a low inland ridge, where its paired rails enter a pale seam of weather, and the first distant roofs gather below. The inland ridge draws nearer until the raised line meets a shallow cutting. Rain lies in the seams of exposed stone, while pale grass bends over the upper edge. The wagons enter between those darker walls at the same measured pace. Harbor water and cranes are hidden now. Along the rock face, runoff gathers on shallow shelves before dropping to the ballast. Loose gravel glints beside the drainage channel along the inner wall. The route ahead is pressed through the hillside toward a scattered line of roofs on the farther side. Beyond the cutting, a road slips under the railway in a low concrete passage. Its wet surface gathers the pale spill of a single lamp. Rain shines across the passage mouth before the grade closes over it. The train crosses overhead, and the brief hollow sound remains below with the drainage water. On the upper grade, the paired steel lines emerge beside scrub and dark fencing. A strip of mist hangs over the ditch where the road rises again. The rails bend gradually toward the settled ground inland. The ridge holds the weather a while, then releases the railway into open ground. Here the roofs stand farther apart, with damp fields occupying the gaps. Window light appears only in scattered points, low under the weather. The freight cars move above them on the embankment, their graphite sides holding a weak reflection from the sky. From this height, service roads curl toward small sheds and disappear behind hedges. A storage yard passes below, its stacked materials softened into shapes by the weather. The port has reduced to a faint brightness along the coast, too distant to shape the ground around the railway. A signal mast stands where the curve straightens. Its lamps remain small against the wet ground. The hood and ladder resolve as the line approaches, then slip behind the last row of wagons. Farther on, the track enters an interval with no nearby lamp. Rain crosses the ballast and low weeds, leaving the next cool point deep within the distance. Water beads along the mast housing, gathering at each lower edge before falling. The long formation occupies the dark space between those fixed lights, one coupled length after another. The coast is now a direction rather than a view. Around the line, damp air softens nearby roofs and gathers against the lower slopes. Your room remains where the night began, beyond rain and the harbor's small lights. Its warmth stays in the weight beneath you as this corridor continues under cooler sky. Window lights simply grow farther apart between the two places. A pale seam of weather rests along the ridge, carrying the line forward. The railway enters a wider shelf of land where the embankment runs straight for a while. Coarse grass and shallow rainwater occupy the margins. A row of utility poles keeps to the road at a distance, each dark shape briefly crossing the pale sky. Between them, the last industrial roofs give way to lower buildings and unlit ground. Wet wires hold small beads that loosen one by one into the ditch. Far along the embankment, the wagons merge into a graphite band beneath a broad layer of weather. Past the cluster of roofs, the land gathers into long dark folds. The track follows their lower contours, appearing and disappearing behind brush as the consist advances. Rain grows finer here, held in the air instead of running across metal. The train rounds a wooded shoulder and shows its length for a moment across the open slope. Several container roofs catch the dim sky, then lose it as the curve turns. Beyond that bend, the railway continues toward country with fewer windows, carrying the night deeper inland along the ridge. The last roofs fall behind as the rails continue inland. You are a long way out tonight and still home. A passing train's wheels and axles divert current around the track relay. The rails themselves therefore become part of the train detection instrument. Beyond the port, the departing freight rolls east beneath a final lamp. You sink from that colored point to the dark wheelset below, where polished wheel rims meet polished running surfaces. The signal becomes a small point behind the wagons. At axle height, sleepers pass in a slow, dark rhythm beneath the train. Ballast gives way to a narrow service margin, then gathers again around each fitted length of rail. The eastbound line carries you farther inland, close to the metal beneath the moving weight. Moisture gathers along one rail web, leaving the upper surface pale and bare. The train lengthens beyond the last port roofs, while the track enters low, unlit ground. Beside the ballast, a cable conduit turns toward a sealed graphite case. The route has moved below the visible instruction and into enclosed metal. Rain beads join along the lower seam before slipping into the stones. Past the built ground, the railway enters a wider dark belt. The freight has become a graphite band above the paired rail tops. You drift with its measured motion as the surrounding roofs separate. The line continues east under open weather, carrying the wheelsets toward the first steep folds inland. A pale seam crosses one rail where the route enters darker ground, then slips beneath the next wagon. The open ground narrows gradually toward the canyon approaches. Rock gathers near the right-of-way, and the rails begin following a longer curve. Beneath the passing freight, each axle crosses from one fitted length into the next. Far ahead, Another low equipment housing stands beside the outside rail, appearing between the wheel sets as the train continues toward it. The outside rail housing draws level with the middle wagons. Its sealed lid holds a narrow line of moisture beneath the rim. A curved metal conduit enters through one side, then disappears below the ballast as the freight carries its repeating underframes past. Network rail defines a track circuit as an electrical system that detects the absence of a train from a section. The bounded length here curves between dark ballast shoulders, with one fitted insulated seam near the rear and another farther inland. The passing consist occupies the metal between them. The railway presses deeper into the narrowing ground. A rock bank rises beside the outer rail, streaked where water has crossed its ledges. On the opposite side, the grade falls toward a dark strip of brush. The freight follows the space between them into the next long bend. Each passing wheel leaves a brief blue-white line on the inner rail before darkness returns. You move farther inland with the long weight of the freight above the curve. Its motion reaches you as a low, even pressure through the ground. The open lower country has narrowed to this corridor of steel and stone, carrying each coupled body toward the darker folds ahead. Loose stone gathers around the sleeper ends where the grade crosses a shallow shelf. Water rests in small hollows beneath the fastenings. Farther along, the paired polished lines enter a band of shadow cast by the canyon wall, while the wagon roofs retain a thin wash of cloud light. Past the shelf, a narrow concrete cable trough begins beside the track, and the wagon's shadows cross its fitted, covers one car at a time. It follows the curve through coarse grass and scattered stone. One section passes under a metal bridge plate, then continues ahead to another equipment case beside the farther running line. The FRA characterizes conventional track circuits as very low voltage devices, generally operating in the 2-volt range. The sealed housing holds that slight pressure, while a loaded consist rolls through overhead, its whole weight read by the faint current under the wheels. The cable trough reaches the equipment case and divides into fitted metal conduits. One bends under the ballast shoulder. Another rises through the sealed base, its curved graphite surface exposed beside the coarse stone. The last wagons pass it, and the case falls behind the train. The eastbound grade continues between a steep rock face and dark water below. Across the river, pale bands of stone appear beneath the brush. The freight follows the inside of the bend, each wagon briefly separated from the next by a narrow opening onto the canyon. You drift lower until the landscape narrows to one rail web and its fitted connection. The connection lies beneath the broad, polished crown where the wheels pass. Damp metal darkens around the fitted stud, while the conductor curves away toward the ballast. Above it, The polished line extends in both directions as one continuous wait through the canyon approach. A freight bogie rolls over that hidden connection. Two wheel sets occupy the frame, joined beneath the graphite car body by dense springs and bearing housings. The narrow contact lines at the rail crowns carry the entire assembly onward, while the conduit remains fixed among the sleepers. Past the bend, the twin rails cross a shelf of pale gravel before entering another cut in the canyon wall. A compact line-side cabinet stands near the farther boundary. Inside, a fully populated row of dark relay housings waits behind the closed metal door as the route advances toward Kamloops. The route leaves the gravel shelf and crosses a narrow steel bridge over dark water. Below, the sleepers, fitted conduits, continue beside the rails. Their curved lengths disappear beneath the next embankment as the freight moves inland. In the Federal Railroad Administration's conventional direct current example, the signal controlling track relay is normally energized when the track is unoccupied. A clear section, therefore, corresponds to an active electrical state. Inside the sealed housing, a pale coil surrounds its metal core, while small contact pieces rest within the mechanism. The relay stays behind its cabinet door as the freight's axles cross its section outside. Two steel lines carry the circuit through the cut, their polished crowns catching a thin blue-white wash from the open sky. You drift downward through the track structure, past dark ballast and squared sleepers. A protected cable turns beneath the grade and meets the rail through a fitted connection. The train passes overhead as a long graphite shape, leaving the smaller metalwork fixed below. Fine moisture rests along the shaded edge of that broad polished crown. Beyond the bridge, the route curves between pale stone and the blue-black river. Wheel rims pass close above the inner rail, each axle held across the bogie beneath springs and housings. Along the shoulder, a low junction case stands beside a cluster of insulated leads disappearing into coarse gravel. The river widens around a dark gravel bar as the railway climbs toward another bend. Beneath the moving cars, paired wheels approach the next insulated boundary. Metal rims, the solid axle, and polished crowns draw close within the same narrow reach of track. And FRA technical report describes the wheel-axle-wheel electrical path as having resistance on the order of 20 microohms. That very low figure makes the metal wheel set an effective shunt. Current crosses through one wheel, the axle, and the opposite wheel, taking that solid path around the track relay. The insulated boundary passes under the final axle. Behind it, a dark composite spacer remains fitted between two bright rail ends. The cars continue around the river bend, leaving the joint among coarse stone and low brush. The railway holds to a shelf above the water, Steel rims turn beneath graphite wagons, while the track curves around a face of pale rock. Across the river, wooded slopes merge into blue-black layers. The paired rails keep close to the ledge and enter another narrow opening ahead. Fine river mist gathers on the lower edge of a steel fastening clip. Farther along, the polished crowns pass over evenly spaced sleepers and compacted stone. The vertical steel below each crown stays darker, interrupted by fitted fasteners and occasional cable connections. You drift at the level of this narrow metal corridor as the river falls partly behind the rock shoulder. A short open reach appears between two cuttings. The train crosses it in a long graphite curve, with each wheelset occupying its own small interval of steel. Low cloud rests over the far slope, and the river shows through gaps between the cars. At the next bend, a protected lead rises from the gravel beside the base of the polished length. Its dark sheath follows a shallow channel toward a compact metal enclosure set back from the track. The paired running lines continue past it into the deeper cutting, where another fitted connection waits beside the stone. Network Rail explains that a failed track circuit normally presents itself as occupied. Uncertainty, therefore, produces the restrictive state. Inside the relay case, a dark armature rests beside separated contact points, and their narrow gaps hold a cool shadow. Along the rails outside, the freight crosses the section, its sound unchanged. The cutting deepens beyond the enclosure. Pale stone rises in damp steps beside the line, and the long cars pass through a narrow blue-gray seam. The river has disappeared behind the wall. Ahead, the rails take a slight curve, where the rock opens enough for low cloud to return. Moisture leaves a dark seam in the ballast, then vanishes beneath the sleepers. You drift lower than the wagon floors, level with the fastenings repeating along the curve. Each steel flange passes above a pale sleeper and is gone. The line reaches a shelf where the cliff falls back from the ballast. Dark cable sheaths appear between the stones, extending toward the next fitted boundary. On the open shelf, the river returns far below rail level. Its surface holds a broken blue-white strip between dark banks. Passing under frames briefly cross the pale water before the cliff gathers beside the route again. Past that opening, the paired rails enter another sheltered reach. Water no longer shines on their crowns here. Fine dust lies beside the inner edges, and the metal takes a duller color under the overhang. The rear wagons remain in open air, while the leading cars pass into the stone. A narrow gravel shelf begins where the cliff draws back. Twin rails cross it in open air, their upper surfaces dry beneath a high break in the cloud. Beyond them, the lower canyon widens toward another long bend, with fitted trackside metal waiting beside the shoulder. U.S. shunting sensitivity regulation specifies a dry track test using a shunt resistance of 0.06 ohm across the rails. A compact fitted link rests between the two dry crowns. The test point slips behind the last wheels. The eastbound train continues over the gravel bench, carrying its long line toward a darker cleft ahead. From this lower height, the wagons are graphite walls above the running surface. Their motion passes through the metal as a soft, repeating tremor. The gravel shelf narrows, and the train's dark length enters another fold of stone ahead. Beyond the stone fold, the track keeps to a bench cut above dark water. The consist lengthens across the open side of the curve, then draws together where the canyon closes again. You move beside the lower steel, near enough for each sleeper end to pass as a pale interval in the ballast. A broader shoulder appears farther on. At a fitted joint, the continuous shine of the rail crown breaks at a narrow, dark seam. Steel fish plates clasp both sides. Beyond it, the next length runs beneath the wagons. Toward Kamloops, the canyon gives more sky to the route. Dry slopes stand back from the track, and the river bends away beneath the grade. The freight stretches through the opening, its rear wagons reduced to a dark band behind the curve. You remain lower, beside the rail crowns, where the next change lies on the metal itself. Deeper inland, the next railhead carries a dull film beneath passing graphite cars. And Fra Field Study found spilled product on the railhead was the leading reported cause of track circuit performance degradation in its data. Beneath the hopper cars, pale residue reaches across the steel crown and settles among the angular stones. The dusty strip narrows behind the last wheel set and disappears where bare steel resumes. The eastbound line leaves the stained section and enters a broader shelf above the river. Dry grass occupies the outer bank. Along the inner margin, dark stone rises beside a single track carrying the freight toward the next bend. You drift at sleeper height, carried past rows of clips and bolt heads set into pale sleepers. Each fitting passes as a small dark shape, then gives way to the next polished length. The canyon wall moves more slowly beyond them. A shallow cutting gathers around the route. The freight enters between low blue-gray walls where loose stone has collected in narrow shelves. Its wheels remain near the ballast, while the wagon bodies pass above as one dark sequence beneath the widening sky. Beside the grade, a covered cable trough follows the curve until the stone wall recedes. The cutting releases the track onto flatter ground near Kamloops. Here, the single path begins to divide through fitted steelwork. Long rails remain nearly parallel at first, while one polished switchblade starts its quiet angle toward the neighboring route. U.S. track circuit rules count a train, locomotive, or car occupying any part of a circuit, including a turnout fouling section. The boundary includes the narrow ground where neighboring routes draw close. A dark wheel flange passes through that fitted wedge of steel. The diverging route opens by degrees, its bright inner edge narrowing across the ballast. The freight continues across the divided ground. Dark wheel rims pass beside switch rods and shallow recesses between the sleepers. Each fitted piece soon slips under the long graphite bodies, leaving another clean length of steel beyond the junction. Past the split, several routes spread across the dry shelf. Their curves remain shallow under the broad blue-gray sky, with low scrub occupying the spaces between raised beds of stone. One branch bends beside a weathered rock bank. The main path keeps nearer the open ground, carrying the wagons past scattered equipment cases and narrow drainage cuts. You drift beside the lower edge of the consist as the last fitted crossing recedes among the stones. A thin strip of shadow rests beneath the rail, where the raised grade crosses uneven ground. The route straightens beyond the outer switchwork. Dry grass lies flat beside the shoulder, and the freight stretches into a longer band beneath the inland sky. Near the steel, a compact graphite detector housing stands low among the fasteners, followed by open track continuing east. An RSSB research abstract describes axle counter occupancy logic as comparing how many axles enter a section with how many leave it. At wheel height, the passing freight supplies the sequence through dense wheel sets, moving under graphite wagon floors. A polished rim arrives above the compact housing, followed by the axle and the opposite rim. Then, the undercarriage opens briefly onto angular stone and sleeper edges. The detector stays low beside metal far larger than itself. Dust clings to its mounting plate. A sheathed cable curves into the ballast. Dark springs and brake rigging pass overhead without hiding the polished flange. Beyond the nearest car, more wheel sets repeat the same slow geometry. The underside of each wagon briefly closes the sky. Between cars, dry grass reappears at the shoulder. Narrow blue-white light crosses the wheel faces before another dark body covers them. The last cars carry their shadows across the open shoulder. You remain near the polished crown as the formation draws ahead. Fasteners pass in a measured row beside its base. Dry stems lean over the ballast margin, pale against the darker ground. The route keeps its broad inland curve, with the wagon sides now reduced to a graphite band under the blue-gray sky. Past the open shoulder, the railway bends through a low reach of weathered rock. The freight shows its length across the curve, wagon after wagon, following the same smooth arc. A dry face rises beside the inner side of the grade. Its shallow ledges hold dust and small fragments of stone. On the outer margin, Scrub spreads across a broad shelf before the land drops away. The rails catch thin light where the bend exposes their upper surfaces. Dark wheel shadows move along that pale seam and disappear behind the wagon skirts. Near the middle of the curve, the consist narrows into overlapping rectangles. Couplers show briefly between them, then fold into shadow again. You drift beside the lower slope, carried through the long turn without rising above the steel. The rock edge slowly falls behind, while a wider inland reach opens ahead. Angular ballast settles tightly around the sleeper ends. Steel clips hold dark shapes against the lighter aggregate, and fine dust lies in the shallow spaces between them. The train passes just beyond this close ground. Its motion reaches the stones as a muted tremor, then thins as the wagons move deeper into the bend. A narrow strip of rail remains bright above the gray shoulder. A wheel flange passes through a shallow band of blue-white reflection. The outer face is darkened by travel, while the curved rim keeps a smoother line beside the rail. Behind it, the axle disappears beneath springs and crossbars. You move level with that low turning surface until the wheel slips behind a fold in the grade, and another length of wagon shadow takes its place. The approach toward Kamloops opens into a wider basin of dry ground and subdued light. Low ridges occupy the distance without enclosing the railway. The freight runs between them on a raised strip of ballast, its dark sides broken by brief gaps at the couplers. Pale scrub gathers in irregular patches beside the grade. A shallow channel follows the lower ground, holding only a dim reflection beneath the sky. The train's long curve begins to straighten across this broader shelf. Wagon roofs form a narrow graphite edge against the fading blue-gray above, while nearer the steel, coarse grass bends in different directions around scattered stones. You travel with the formation as the rock faces loosen into lower banks. The route has room to lengthen here. Its rails extend through open ground, then turn gently around a dark shoulder where the leading wagons vanish. Behind that bend, the remaining cars continue feeding into the same quiet line. Near a shallow curve, a compact detector head appears beside the outer track. Its graphite casing rises little above the fasteners. A narrow metal bracket holds it over coarse aggregate, with dry stems gathered near the base. The passing wagon sides remain farther up the grade, softened by dust. Ahead of the small enclosure, polished metal turns around the low bank and continues into open country. The line leaves the low bank and crosses a broad patch of level ground. You travel near the rail tops, where their narrow surfaces divide the pale shoulder from darker scrub. Wagon shadows move across the aggregate in long intervals. Beyond them, the inland sky rests over low terrain without a sharp boundary. The steel carries on toward a sparse cluster of trackside cases beside the coming curve. At the the rock shoulder, the leading wagons disappear around the bend, while the remaining formation advances across the open shelf. Dark car bodies pass above dense wheel shadows and pale sleeper ends. The curve tightens slightly beside a bank of broken stone, placing the lower rails in a thin band of reflected sky. Past the final visible axle, fresh steel continues east between dry grass and graphite equipment housings. The equipment housings thin out as the rails carry the freight beyond the rock shoulder. Low cuts alternate with strips of pale grass. Through each opening, the inland ground spreads wider ahead. The wagons keep their shallow curve toward Kamloops, their lower edges holding a narrow wash of sky, while the aggregate darkens beneath them. A single insulated joint crosses the polished crown, its dark seam flush with the surrounding metal. Past the joint, the formation runs onto a long shelf above sparse scrub. Its curve loosens. Wagons compressed against the rock now lengthen into separate dark rectangles, each moving on the same thin line. You drift just above the sleepers as the valley floor widens below. The route is nearing Kamloops, though the freight remains a narrow graphite thread across the pale ground. Near the shelf's eastern edge, the train rounds one more low shoulder. The last compact cases stand among coarse grass as the grade begins to rise. Ahead, the route narrows between darker folds of land. The freight enters, that opening one wagon at a time. The wide valley remains behind its final car, and the steel begins its slow climb under the blue-gray night. The final axle passes. A narrow blue sheen stays along the polished crown of the rising track. You remain with the climb as the low ridges gather closer. The freight grows smaller between them, carrying its muted rhythm into higher country. Below, two steel lines hold the night and continue east. Beyond the canyon approaches, the railway rises into the winter-shadowed folds of Rogers Pass. You travel with the grade, farther from the lower valleys and deeper among blue-black slopes. The rails turn beneath dark conifers, then draw toward a wall of mountain where an opening has been cut into the rock. Pale drifts hold in the high gullies, while the steel line continues beneath them. The pass gathers closely around the track. Snow rests on broken ledges above the grade, and the open sky narrows between steep mountain faces. A tunnel portal waits where the railway meets the slope, its dark entrance set beneath a shallow rim of frost. Parks Canada identifies 3 tunnels used by present-day trains through Glacier National Park: the Connaught Tunnel, the Mount Shaughnessy Tunnel, and the Mount MacDonald Tunnel across Rogers Pass. Their entrances lie in mountain folds along the working route, dark openings held beneath blue-white alpine shadow. Inside the mountain, the railway runs through stone toward a distant opening. The tunnel walls return the low movement of the freight in a softened band. Moisture lies along the rough interior, while the rails continue through the darkness toward the next pale reach. You pass beneath the weight of the ridge and emerge among quieter slopes. The mountain air lies pale across the grade. Low drifts fill the shallow ground beside the ballast, leaving the railway as a narrow, dark seam through the pass. Near the next turnout, wind-blown powder gathers around the switchwork. Dark steel parts rise through the white surface in close, fitted shapes. The route divides here, not as a line on a distant map, but as tapered rails meeting beneath the mountain weather. Under the Canadian rail operating rules, when ice or snow conditions warrant, a movement must stop before trailing through a spring switch, so its points can be examined. A graphite locomotive waits short of the turnout, while powder fills the narrow seam beside the tapered rail. A narrow ridge of powder remains beside the point, where polished steel meets the darker stock rail. You drift above the turnout as the grade crosses a shallow alpine shelf. One path bends toward a rock wall. The other continues beneath a broad, wind-packed slope. Between them, the fitted rails form a dark, narrowing triangle before the lines draw apart through scattered conifers. The freight eases forward through the curving path. Its locomotive enters the bend first, followed by dark wagons carrying faint snowlight along their upper edges. The formation stretches across the turnout and onto the ledge beyond, each coupled length taking the same narrow arc beneath the mountain wall. The final wagon slips beyond the points, and the Alpine junction is empty again. Past the turnout, the railway presses along a ledge cut beneath the ridge, where low graphite equipment cases stand at intervals between drifts and granite shoulders. Their sealed doors face the track, each one half in blue-white shadow. The freight carries you onward through the narrow band, where snow lies against steel and stone. Beyond the trackside cases, a low concrete equipment building sits against the slope. Wind-packed powder has banked around the sill, leaving a narrow graphite entrance beneath the roof. The railway curves past its wall. You drift toward the recessed doorway, where blue-white pinpoints deepen inside the mountain shadow. Interlocking logic permits movement only when the relevant routes have been set, locked, and detected in safe combinations. In the recessed room, blue-white pinpoints gather across a wall of graphite housings. The freight continues beyond the switch fan, leaving its branching steel among the pale drifts. You pass inward through the concrete doorway. The air carries a faint electrical hum, separated from the wind along the grade. Dark conduits turn at the ceiling and descend toward sealed cabinets, while the curve outside slips farther into the pass. A machined graphite block rests on a low steel shelf farther in. Shallow channels cross its upper face, interrupted by fitted metal stops. It gives the branching root a weight you could hold, while blue-white reflections move along the recessed edges. Outside the building, the switch fan is already receding. Parallel steel lines divide across the blue-black pass at different depths. The freight keeps to one polished pair. Snow fills the unused spaces between sleepers, softening every surface except the chosen rail. A frost line crosses the outer cable sleeve, then stops at the sealed wall. Past the last conduit bend, the interior widens. Graphite cabinets stand close together, their fronts filled with compact modules and sparse blue-white points. Cable bundles disappear into the floor at their bases. You drift between the rows, toward the cooler depth, where the physical root will give way to electronic logic. Modern electronic interlockings are specialized computers running railway root locking logic. Their purpose is narrow, carrying the securing rules through fitted processor modules. One compact unit rests behind a graphite faceplate, with blue-white light held along the edges of its metal tray. Below the module bay, dense cable bundles descend through fitted openings in the raised floor. Each bundle keeps its curve as it disappears into the dark space beneath the cabinets. You move onward above that hidden depth, following the metal floor panels toward another enclosed section. A narrow ventilation grill carries the cabinet hum into the unheated passage. The passage bends beyond a sealed metal door. Cabinets give way to a lower room where conduits descend from the ceiling in parallel runs. Their pale fittings catch the overhead light, then vanish behind a row of enclosed junction cases near the far partition. Inside one open chassis, fitted circuit boards stand in close ranks behind a dark backplane. Fine metal edges divide the interior into shallow slots. Blue-white points dot the assembly, while the surrounding cabinet absorbs most of their light. You pass the chassis and enter a narrower aisle beside the mountain wall. A frost-edged service door occupies one end, its recessed frame holding a thin band of reflected snow light. Along the opposite side, closed equipment cases continue toward a second turn. Around that turn, dense terminal frames rise from the floor beneath branching conduit runs. Fitted wires gather into compact rows before entering sealed metal housings. The aisle continues between them toward the next layer of root equipment. Past the terminal frames, bundled conductors disappear into a sealed floor duct. The passage widens around a waist-high cabinet with fitted metal doors and shaded lamps. Thick cable looms enter through its lower edge. Beyond the cabinet, the concrete aisle reaches a darker room. The final cable bundle bends beneath a shallow brushed steel cover laid across the concrete floor. On the far side of a dark doorway, a physical root panel occupies a recessed bay. Thin blue-white lines divide across its graphite face. Fitted lamps sit at the junctions under narrow metal shades. You drift across the branching pattern and into the place where each root condition is gathered. Under 49 CFR Part 236, an interlocking circuit may show an indication more favorable than restricted speed only when every governed switch, movable point frog, and derail is correctly positioned. Small blue-white lamps remain separated across the fully populated logic rack. Outside the room, one rail crossing lies half clear of wind-blown powder. Polished steel widens around a fitted moving nose, while dark web plates descend into the ballast. Fine crystals occupy the sheltered seams. A graphite actuator rod leaves the crossing and passes beneath a low protective cover. Powder dusts the closed mechanism housing, while one steel rod continues beneath the rail. Past the covered rod, a dense group of steel linkages fills the inner side of the turnout. Each piece has a different thickness and reach, from flat bars near the sleepers to a compact block beside the stock rail. Snow lies in the deeper gaps. The last linkage enters a recessed, locking assembly, where the line begins another slow curve through the pass. U.S. interlocking standards require a facing point lock or switch end lock movement for mechanically operated switches, movable point frogs, and split point derails. A polished locking bar enters a compact housing, while dark linkages gather close to the sleepers. The recessed housing sits low beside the rail. Frost gathers around its bolted cover, leaving the fitted opening clear where the bar enters. You drift outward along the linkage as it leaves the compact lock. The flat steel length passes over dark timbers and reaches another joint near the branching rails. Its surface holds a narrow blue-white sheen, broken at each fitted pin. A narrow seam of powder rests, untouched, between the fitted steel pieces. The track opens into a broader spread of intersecting steel. One route curves toward a dark cutting, while another keeps close to the slope. Between them, the locking parts have become small shapes near the ground, half sheltered by rail and packed ballast. At the crossing, a fitted rail nose occupies the center of the converging lines. Wind has combed the loose powder into pale ridges around the heavier metal. Beyond the crossing, bundled conduits leave the trackside housings and enter a dark equipment room cut into the slope. A fully populated route panel carries two thin blue-white paths across its graphite face, meeting near a dense group of fitted lamps. U.S. interlocking logic must prevent signals from displaying aspects that would permit conflicting movements. At the crossing outside, two hooded masts stand on opposite approaches to the same snow-lined rails, their fitted lamps facing different paths beneath a dark steel lattice. From the equipment room, the bundled conduits pass beneath flat covers beside the ballast. Their graphite lids form a narrow procession down the slope, interrupted by drifts and pale metal clasps. You move above that thin line until it divides beside separate trackside housings. The room has fallen behind. Low cases follow the outer path until the crossing slips below the shoulder. The junction recedes below, and a single track climbs into the blue-black shoulder of the range. A hooded signal stands where the grade curves along a shelf of rock. Snow presses against the lower edge of its graphite case, leaving the round lenses clear beneath their rims. Farther along, the steel narrows into a darker cut. The freight occupies only a low band there, its roofs catching a thin wash from the cloud above. Loose powder lifts once along the embankment and settles beside the sleepers. The mast recedes as the leading wagons enter the stone. Along the cutting, parallel rail tops carry a faint sheen through blue-black stone. Frost lies in shallow fastenings beside them, pale against the dark clips. The route bends past the nearest slope, where isolated reflections gather across the pale, inner curve. The wagons enter that bend in a slow sequence, each roof briefly taking the muted light above the ridge. Small ledges in the rock hold narrow shelves of powder over the passing line. You move level with the freight as the rock sides draw closer. Dark wagons pass through alternating bands of snowlight and shadow. The track remains beneath the long formation, turning gradually across the slope. A faint vibration travels through the ballast, while the high country opens again beyond the cutting. Far ahead, a separate signal case appears beside an unbroken patch of snow. Farther along the grade, another graphite enclosure stands beside a wider patch of wind-packed powder. Its door is closed, with frost gathered along the lower hinge, and a narrow conduit disappearing beneath the sill. Past the case, one hooded mast holds a pale lamp over the steel. The freight is still short of that post. The intervening rails lie straight across the white ground before curving out along the ridge, where the blue-black slope leaves room for a longer view of the approach. The freight reaches the long view that opened beyond the enclosure. Its leading wagons pass the pale signal and continue around the ridge. Snow rests in the lee of each sleeper, while exposed steel carries a faint sheen through the curve. Across the open slope, the formation lengthens into a dark band between the upper drifts and the drop into forest. U.S. rules require approach or time locking for interlocking signals that display indications more favorable than restricted speed. In the equipment room, dense relay faces sit behind closed glass, their small pale points separated by graphite frames. Outside, wind-polished crust rests against a steel cable trough without covering its fitted lid. The grade carries the freight past the mast and into a broader shelf. One rail route stays with the main curve. Another separates across a pale hollow, then passes behind a low bank where its polished surface disappears. The two paths remain visible together for only a short reach before rock and spruce divide them. A concrete equipment shelter stands above the divided tracks, partly recessed into the slope. Frost edges the steel door. Several conduits leave its base and descend through coarse stone toward the railway. No light reaches the roof from the valley below. Only the snowfield gives the walls a dim blue-white edge. You drift alongside the upper route as the wagons pass the shelter. The line bends over a buried drainage channel and enters a narrow stand of spruce. Between the trunks, the lower track appears in brief silver sections. Each glimpse lies at a different level, showing how the railway threads through folded ground. Past the trees, steelwork gathers around a compact junction on the open grade. Point rods run low along the sleepers. A fitted case stands near the converging rails, and a hooded signal occupies the outer margin. The freight continues along the cleared path, while the neighboring line bends nearer, bringing the route-setting hardware back into the snow. Under the Canadian rail operating rules, a route cleared for a movement is not changed unless the locomotive engineer acknowledges that the new routing can be followed. In the cab, a muted console glow rests below the windshield as the selected rails continue across the white grade. The freight moves beyond the clustered switchwork. One line narrows behind a pale drift, while the chosen path hugs the slope. Dark wagons pass a row of low steel covers, each separated by a small interval of wind-smoothed powder. The junction slowly reduces to two polished edges behind them. You drift along a narrow ledge between spruce shadow and an open white field. The grade leaves the closest trees and crosses a broad rock shoulder. Snow lies shallow on windward stone and deeper in protected seams. Far below, a dark watercourse threads between pale banks, then disappears behind the next fold of land. The wagons curve above it, carrying small roof reflections away from the pass. The slope opens into lower ground, where winter cover thins around exposed rock. Paired rails straighten after the final mountain curve, carrying the wagons through a wide interval of darker earth. The last deep drifts remain tucked against the hillside. At the far margin, water holds a narrow line of pale sky. Far beyond the alpine grade, a steel span occupies the black water ahead. Its lattice sides rise from graphite piers, and the track reaches the near abutment in one straight line. The central structure rests over the channel beneath a pale sky. Frost follows the riveted seams where the rails enter the bridge deck. U.S. movable bridge interlocking rules specify that the bridge's locking members must sit within 1 inch of their proper positions. Beside the near rail, a fitted steel bar enters a graphite housing, with frost around the bolts and black water moving beyond the lattice. Riveted plates climb from the deck into the first diagonal brace. Meltwater gathers along the lower flange, then slips from the steel into the channel. Through the upright openings, the far bank appears as a dim strip of rock and winter crust. The track lies straight between the lattice sides. Overhead, cross members divide the pale sky into quiet sections, each passing above the freight before the following brace takes its place. Higher braces disappear into cloud shadow, their rivet lines fading in the mountain air. You drift beside the freight as its leading wagons enter the truss. Long graphite sides pass through alternating bands of open sky and shadowed steel. Each interval reveals water, a pier, then the distant bank before the framing closes again. Snow remains in pale seams along the outer walkway. Under the wheels, the deck carries a muted rhythm through metal. The mountain shoulders recede at either end of the channel, leaving the train suspended for a while between rock and sky. Couplers draw into slight angles inside the bridge, then straighten as each car reaches the middle of the crossing. Below, dark water divides around a broad pier and reunites behind it. Thin ice rests against the upstream face, pressed into pale, overlapping sheets. The moving surface catches a few blue-white fragments from the open sky, then carries them beneath the deck. From this lower reach, the truss is a dark ceiling crossed by light. Freight cars appear briefly between the steel diagonals and vanish behind the central pier. Near the bank, pale reeds bend over the margin where the current slows. Along the deck, paired rails cross fitted plates where the movable structure meets the fixed approach. The joints show as dark seams beneath a skin of frost. Snow has collected against the inner lattice edge, sheltered from the wind. A wagon passes over the meeting place, and its shadow travels across bolts, rail clips, and pale crust. Beyond the final braces, the far abutment grows broader with every wheel that crosses. Its stone face rises from the water to meet the dark ballast on shore. The final diagonal slips past, leaving the white-crusted abutment open ahead. Stone joints rise beside the rails, and the track continues onto darker ground. Beyond the bridge, low brush appears between patches of old drifts. The line follows the water, separated from it by a shelf of stone. Freight wagons extend around the bend, their upper edges catching a weak band of sky. Behind them, the lattice span has reduced to a dark frame between the banks. Ahead, forest opens in small clearings, each one revealing more of the lower valley before spruce closes around the railway again. Loose powder lies in the shaded cuts. On the riverside, exposed rock drops in broad steps to the moving surface, and the steel line keeps its level course between the two. You pass above the water on the stone shelf, carried with the curve rather than the current below. The channel broadens beside the railway. Dark gravel bars appear between smooth bands of water, and winter crust lies back beneath the trees. The steep alpine walls have begun to stand farther apart. Their upper ridges remain blue-white under the late sky. A low veil of mist rests at the base of the farther slope, thinning where the valley turns east. Small spruce tops punctuate the lower bank against the pale ground behind them. The railway leaves the channel at a gentle bend and enters an open reach beneath the foothills. Long freight cars form a straight line between dark stands of spruce. Behind the curve, the bridge is a fine lattice with black water showing through its center. The mountains loosen around the eastward rails. Pale snow survives in shaded pockets beside the ballast, and the route crosses level ground beneath a widening sky. Far ahead, the paired steel takes one more shallow curve and passes into the dark interior beyond the last high ridge. On Canadian single track in centralized traffic control territory, a crew member broadcasts the displayed advanced signal's name over the designated standby radio channel. The words leave the locomotive as the mountain walls fall back. Below, one freight train enters the open prairie, and the railway narrows into a dark seam beneath scattered cloud. At the rail traffic controller's position, the same territory occupies a far smaller expanse. Thin route lines cross the panel, with sparse points held against the dark surface. The broadcast is only a passing sound beside that broad arrangement. Cool light lies along the graphite rim. Beyond the control room, the prairie continues past the panel's pale edge into a wider band of night. You drift east above the rails as the foothills flatten behind the last cars. The freight is no longer enclosed by rock. Its dark length moves across open ground beside a narrow service road. A few fixed lights stand far apart along the railway. Between them, grass and shallow drainage cuts pass under the train as broad graphite bands. Inside the locomotive, the radio returns to its low electrical hush. A speaker grill, plane controls, and the small glow of the set remain beside the dark window. Outside, the flat line ahead lengthens beneath a sky with fewer clouds. A shallow watercourse interrupts the prairie, and a steel bridge carries the line across it. The freight reaches the far bank one coupled car at a time. Blue-white reflections divide beneath the bridge members, then close again as the last car clears the span. Past the water, the track resumes its narrow course through low grass and open darkness. Farther east, a controlled signal stands where a siding meets the main track. Its hooded lenses face the approaching freight across a long interval of open ground. The paired rails draw toward that fixed post, while the dispatch map reaches ahead into the next set of permissions. A Canadian controlled signal can remain at stop until the rail traffic controller requests a less restrictive indication. Thin route lines cross the dim graphite panel, and a few cool points mark the railway beyond the room. You drift above the locomotive, then higher over the land it has crossed. The headlight narrows to a pale seam between the rails. Behind it, coupled cars merge into one graphite length. The fields carry no sharp boundary in the darkness, only shallow changes of tone where grass, bare soil, and a narrow service track divide the plain. Wind moves through low prairie grass beside the ballast, leaving the steel alone. From higher still, the railway draws a dark thread across the plain. Farm roads meet it at pale angles, and isolated roofs gather near patches of blue-white light. The locomotive is now one moving point within a much longer corridor. You remain with that point as the land opens farther on, past shallow hollows where mist gathers and broad fields absorb the scattered western glow. The train's radio voice has faded into the night. On the locomotive roof, a short antenna passes beneath long cloud bands and the darker spaces between them. You drift just above the steel for a while, carried east with the faint vibration of wheels below, and the plain extending beyond the nearest roofs. Farther east, cylindrical grain bins stand beside an unlit access road. Their curved roofs hold a faint wash from the cloud, then lose it as the train moves on. The buildings remain behind as pale forms against the plain. Ahead, the main track crosses a shallow rise and disappears briefly into darker ground. On the farther side of the rise, another length of track comes in from the north. It runs beside the main line before drawing close. A small equipment case stands near the meeting point, its metal face silvered by the night air. The freight remains on the through route as the two lines occupy the same narrow strip of prairie. The northern alignment stays close for a while, then opens into the plain beside the moving freight. The locomotive draws its coupled cars through an immense rectangle of fallow ground. Farm roofs remain as isolated blue-white points near the horizon. Behind the last wagon, the meeting place contracts to a dark notch in the grass. The plain keeps widening around the train. A township road crosses, then a cluster of low roofs slips away behind. From the height of the control territory, the freight is a short moving line between widely spaced points. Its path carries east through darkness too broad for any one window to contain. You drift beyond the grain bins, carried east where the prairie leaves more darkness between its small lights. The Federal Railroad Administration summarizes the basic functions of positive train control as enforcing train authority and speed. Inside the lead unit, a recessed glass face sits among fitted metal modules. Small blue-white pinpoints remain within the enclosure as prairie darkness moves past the cab. The freight crosses a shallow swale where the rails sink between low shoulders of prairie soil. For a moment, the locomotive's window glow disappears behind the nearer bank. It returns on the farther slope, followed by the dark rectangular sides of the first cars. You move with the long formation as its sound spreads thinly across the fields. Stars occupy the open sky above the cars. Far below them, the locomotive carries one small cluster of cool light toward the next rise. The train's length passes gradually into that darker reach, wagon after wagon, while the horizon remains low and nearly unbroken. At the following rise, the railbed emerges on a low embankment. Its steel edges gather a pale sheen before bending across the next field. Positive train controls speed layer includes civil engineering speed restrictions and temporary slow orders, not only wayside signal indications. The rail line descends from the rise and crosses a field with no nearby building. Low grass leans along the ballast, silvered by the open sky. The wagons follow the grade in a long graphite band. Their small side reflections appear and fade as the ground falls gently toward a broad prairie hollow. At the bottom of the hollow, a narrow creek passes beneath the railway and disappears into reeds. You rise again with the cars, farther into country spread beneath the stars. A grain elevator stands well away from the line, reduced to a pale vertical shape among dark fields. The locomotive remains a tight cluster of cool points on the grade. Its coupled length follows the gentle change in height and carries a low sound across the plain. Near the horizon, a slender radio mast stands beside a low railway enclosure. Its fittings are too distant to resolve, leaving only the vertical line and sparse cool pinpoints against the sky. The route passes without turning toward it. Open land resumes on the other side, divided by fence lines and faint bands of planted ground. A pale farm road meets the railway at a right angle, then vanishes between two unlit fields. Beyond the crossing, a parallel track appears at the edge of the open ground. It follows the eastbound route across pale ballast before curving inward near a low signal housing. The locomotive draws nearer as steel edges divide beneath the passing cloud. Farther along, they gather again and continue toward the next fixed arrangement in the prairie darkness. U.S. positive train control requirements specifically account for a mainline switch in an improper position for the approaching train's route. Across the open ground, a low graphite equipment enclosure stands beside the converging rails. Its metal door is closed against the night, with a few blue-white status points beneath the eave. The long consist passes the branching track and enters a level reach of prairie. Freight cars stretch across the section in a dark chain, then shorten with distance. Their upper edges catch the lightest part of the sky, while the parallel route falls away toward a separate horizon. At trackside, a bundled cable conduit rises from pale gravel and disappears beneath a sealed metal case. You drift farther above the railway, where field boundaries form broad graphite squares around the moving train. A farm pond holds one dim patch of sky. The rails cross that immense plain without changing direction, and the nearest town has thinned to several blue-white points near the horizon. Near the far margin of the fields, a fixed signal stands beside one line of steel. Its lamp remains small at this distance. The locomotive passes below it, and the mast becomes a narrow mark among pale grasses, while another equipment cabinet sits beyond the next shallow rise. Within the lead unit, a fully populated graphite console remains enclosed in dim light. Small blue-white points occupy separate rows, and a dark glass panel carries only a muted glow. The train's motion reaches the fitted metalwork as a slight vibration. Outside the cab windows, open ground slips past in long bands without a fence or roof nearby. Past the rise, the railway runs toward a cluster of fixed housings and a sealed steel box. Buried conduits meet the assembly at the gravel shoulder. The compact forms grow clearer as the locomotive crosses the open distance toward them. U.S. train control requirements integrate wayside or cab signal authorities and indications, so the onboard system can provide associated warnings and enforcement. The trackside assembly slips past the side window. Within the cab, one pale indicator occupies a fully populated graphite panel among fitted modules and dark glass. Open grass continues beyond the locomotive, crossed by the straight steel route. Past the front windows, the railway extends through low prairie grass. The locomotive hood divides the lower darkness, while twin rails gather the faint sky along their upper faces. A fixed lamp remains far ahead, separated from the cab by open ground and a shallow bend. The fixed housing shrinks into the prairie, one pale point beside two dark rails. You drift higher over the eastbound line. Dark fields spread on either side of the ballast, divided by faint boundaries and an occasional farm road. The freight occupies only a narrow length within that breadth. Its graphite roofs pass beneath you, each catching a small measure of the open sky before sliding onward across the plain. You ease back down until the grade rises to meet you, and pale grasses lean beside the ballast. Freight wagons pass above them as long dark walls, briefly opening to the sky at each coupling. Beyond the ballast, the land continues without a close roof or embankment, carrying the railway into a broader reach of night. The locomotive roof moves beneath a clear reach of sky. Its dark equipment contours rise only slightly above the metal, leaving most of the frame to scattered stars. Far below that open field of light, the paired rails remain a narrow blue-black seam through the grass. Farther east, the track crosses a shallow hollow and climbs toward level ground. The stars continue above the grade, while the freight enters the next open reach. The Federal Railroad Administration notes that some of these enforcement systems determine train position through the Global Positioning System, supplemented by onboard devices. Above the grassland, the freight occupies a narrow seam beneath scattered stars. You drift above the cab until the long consist loses its separate wagons. Field boundaries spread around the steel route, pale where the night thins over grass and dark soil. The signal lamps have become isolated points along a line extending east, while the last mountain contours have disappeared behind the level distance. One small satellite passes above the continent, its metal body set against deeper stars. From higher still, darkness covers most of the land. The railway is too fine to separate from the fields, though scattered settlements leave faint clusters beneath the atmosphere. The freight continues within that scale, carried through a territory that now fits under one broad curve. The level country returns below, divided by long field margins and occasional grain bins. You settle the rest of the way down, and dry grass bends beside the raised grade. A narrow road meets the railway near a low equipment shelter, then continues into unlit farmland. The freight passes through the crossing and leaves its pale surfaces behind, carrying the route toward another turnout farther along the plain. The next wayside interface unit stands near that turnout in a sealed metal housing. A fitted conduit reaches it from the ballast shoulder. Beyond the cabinet, the rails separate briefly through the switch and continue into the dark eastern reach. Some PTC architectures distribute decisions locally through peer-to-peer communication between a train and wayside interface units, instead of relying entirely on a central office. Near the turnout, a compact rooftop antenna rides above the locomotive, while the fitted cabinet remains beside the switch. The rails draw together beyond the switch and settle into one eastward line. Stubble fields reach outward on either side, divided by wire fences and pale service tracks. The consist moves between them, its dark roof catching a brief wash of moonlight before the grade enters a shallow fold. Dry seed heads brush the ballast edge, then fall still behind the passing wheels. A grain elevator rises from the next cluster of low buildings. The sidings beneath it lie dark, with their steel tops faintly silver under the sky. The freight passes the outer track and continues beyond the bins, where cultivated ground opens again into long shadowed strips. You rise above the line as the locomotive becomes a graphite mark between long fields. Farm roads divide the land at quiet intervals, and a few roof lights remain below. Higher up, the stars hold their spacing while the railway continues beneath them. At the next boundary, fence posts climb a low rise beside the grade. Their wire catches a narrow sheen, then vanishes where the slope turns away. Beyond it, coarse grass covers the shallow ground between the railway and a distant shelter belt. The embankment lifts onto firmer ground, carrying the freight above a narrow drainage hollow. Low ridges begin to gather beyond the fields. One pale signal point waits deep in the eastern distance, with the single track extending toward it through darker grass. The pale signal ahead enlarges slowly as the embankment reaches the low ridge. Around it, the ground remains broad and unlit, divided by fence lines and shallow hollows. The locomotive passes beneath the fixed lamp, followed by wagon after wagon. Its glow travels briefly along the upper edges of the cars, then falls behind their coupled length. The final wagon takes the crest and descends, leaving the mast alone above the western slope. A darker interval opens east of the post, where the railway continues between fields without a nearby road. Dark grass closes around the grade, and the fixed lamp contracts behind the moving roofs. Faint field tracks branch from the right-of-way and lose themselves among the low swells. The consist holds its course through those crossings, already drawing toward the next rise. Past the signal, long grasses lean away from the raised grade. A narrow service track appears beside the ballast, follows the railway through a gradual bend, and ends at a small equipment enclosure. Beyond it, the land gathers into low swells. Their crests hide portions of the freight before returning the dark roofs to view. Sparse farm lights remain separate from the steel corridor, set deep among shelter belts and pale yards. You move with the coupled wagons through the long bend. Their muted rhythm passes beneath you, steady enough to feel like distance itself. The nearest field slips away into a broad band of darkness. Farther off, a low cluster of roofs rests behind bare branches, with a dim yard lamp held beside the buildings. The railway keeps to open ground, carrying you beyond the last close view of the signal mast. The prairie widens into long parcels beneath the night. Field boundaries meet at quiet angles, interrupted by dry creek beds and narrow roads. A pale gravel lane crosses several dark divisions before turning toward an isolated yard. The railway cuts through that larger pattern as a dark line. A freight consist occupies only a small part of it, its head beyond a field boundary, while the final cars remain behind it. Low cloud drifts over the northern fields, leaving the eastern sky clear above the rails. Farther south, a winding watercourse draws a softer course among the straighter edges. Scattered buildings remain small within the parcels, each separated from the next by grass and cultivated ground. Their sparse lamps fade before the freight reaches the farther boundary. For a while, only the embankment marks the land, with pale ballast suspended between dark fields. Farther east, the track approaches a scattered settlement without entering its closest streets. A road curves toward a group of low roofs, then turns away beside a dark stand of trees. The freight remains outside that loose circle of buildings. Its cars pass along the settlement's open margin, where shallow water slips beneath the grade and field entrances meet the roadside. Soon the roofs recede into isolated shapes, and the railway returns to grassland under a wider band of stars. Above the fields, the last thin cloud layer separates into pale fragments. Clear darkness opens through the gaps and continues beyond the weather. Below, a freight line and a country road run close for a time, then divide around a low rise. Sparse lamps follow the roadway toward distant buildings. The steel corridor keeps its straighter course beneath the high night. Past the rise, the road descends toward a cluster of trees, while the railway stays on the lifted grade. Road and rail draw apart until a broad reach of grassland lies between them. You are carried with that thin course as the prairie falls farther away. The locomotive has become a small graphite shape at the head of a much longer band. Its motion is measured against shelter belts, field corners, and occasional pools of pale ground light. None of those marks stays close for long. They pass beneath the coupled cars, diminish behind the final wagon, and leave the route extending toward the eastern dark. At the farthest reach of the prairie, rails and sky share an immense field of night. A low bank of cloud rests beyond the last visible road. Sparse stars continue over the route, while the freight draws its narrow length through the grassland below. A low swell slowly hides the locomotive from view. Wagons follow into the same shallow fold, each coupled shape following the last. On the farther slope, their upper edges return beneath the clear sky, darker than the fields around them. The line passes a small pond held among reeds, then climbs once more toward open ground. Behind the final car, the paired rails retain a faint sheen on the near slope. Ahead, another section appears beyond the crest and enters the eastern distance between wide, unlit fields. Beyond that slender reflection, the grade keeps rising through grass and scattered brush. Its rails meet the dark crest and continue on the unseen farther side. The prairie-wide dispatch map begins to fold westward. Its branching lines draw inward across the dark country until the far network narrows to two steel paths. You drift above that quiet convergence, carried toward the coast, while the broad interior passes beneath a low band of cloud. Transport Canada identifies Canadian National and Canadian Pacific as Canada's two major class I-freight railways, which handle most of the country's freight rail traffic on separate tracks across the interior. long consists past low grain silos and dark fields beneath sparse blue-white lamps. From this height, the eastern distance has softened into one blue-black margin. The paired routes extend through shallow valleys and open ground. Your weight remains where the room first gathered it, while the railway carries you west across a country reduced to scattered lights. The long corridors bend under low cloud, carrying their few lamps toward the western ranges. Farther west, the broad system loses its distant branches. Separate paths draw close beside a blue-black river, then settle into one corridor along the bank. A graphite freight train follows the water through the valley, its roofline carrying a faint wash from the cloud. The land closes gently around the route. Fences and shallow cuttings replace the prairie width, with pale ballast along the rails. Ahead, one mast rises beyond the next bend. Its hooded housing is a dark shape against the open sky, held farther along the steel. A Canadian block signal is a fixed signal positioned at the entrance to a block. The mast beyond the bend stands at that threshold, with its housing over one line of pale ballast. The freight reaches it, and the narrow valley continues on the other side. The locomotive passes first. Long wagon roofs follow, each briefly crossing under the fixed housing before the signal recedes. From the rear of the consist, the post becomes a single graphite stroke beside the curve, then slips behind the riverbank. The rails run close beside the water for a while. Gray gravel banks widen where the current bends away, leaving open ground between the steel and the blue-black channel. The wagon's sides hold one blue-white band from the clouded western sky. The route turns through longer folds of land. Tree lines gather on the lower ground, and isolated roofs appear near crossings without enclosing the railway. You remain above the train's slow curve. The former web of distant paths has narrowed to paired steel, one bank of ballast, and a fixed light far along the next straight. Low cloud gathers against the slopes ahead. The freight enters its thin lower edge, where the nearest trees soften and the farther rails disappear. Only the polished upper faces remain for a moment, carrying two faint lines west through the mist. The next mast emerges where the railway leaves the cloud. Its hooded lens marks the clearest point on the line ahead. The freight rounds the approach, drawing its coupled length through a shallow curve as the housing grows distinct against the darker land. In Canadian automatic block signal territory, passing a block signal displaying stop requires instructions from the rail traffic controller. The long consist lies along a shallow bend, while pale mist moves through the trees beyond the rail. Behind the final wagon, the valley narrows around a blue-black river, with the railway following its bank. You drift above the consist as it slips west under thin cloud. The broad map has folded into a single steel line beside the river. Each wagon takes the curve in sequence, carrying you nearer to the older layers of the railway. Under the Canadian rules for this automatic block territory, a movement delayed within a block may be required to continue at reduced speed to the next signal. The freight moves beneath a long hillside, its roofs briefly taking the pale light. Mist thins among wet firs beside a narrow track shelf edged with silver-gray gravel. The modern mast falls far behind as the line enters older railway practice. A weathered timber frame stands beside silver-gray rails, its crosspiece held above the ballast. The freight slips past its squared posts and continues into blue-black country. The Smithsonian records hand signals, flags, and ball signals among the early forms of fixed railroad signaling. Beside the track, a folded cloth rests against a timber post, while one graphite ball remains raised on its frame. The raised ball recedes behind the train. Farther west, a thin wire follows the railway on timber poles, crossing open ground where the old line bends beneath a pale evening sky. The spread of railway telegraph lines in the 1850s allowed train orders to be transmitted quickly between stops. A locomotive could remain far down the track, while its instruction had already reached the station ahead. Beside the brass key, a folded sheet rests on dark wood. Across the dusk, the pole line passes one silent span at a time. At the next stop, a small room stands beside the track. A narrow walnut desk faces the wall, with blank, folded paper near a brass telegraph fitting. The wire enters through a porcelain sleeve and leaves the room again, continuing west from pole to pole. Past the station, the overhead wire begins to fall away from the railway. A brass connection meets the rail at a narrow joint, leaving the paired steel to continue across graphite ballast. William Robinson's later patent looks back to the basic patent for his closed rail circuit signaling system, granted in August 1872. The paper recedes into shadow. Ahead, a compact control panel stands against a dark wall, its small lamps arranged above a single railway route. An Indian Railways CAMTCH handbook dates the first centralized traffic control installation to 1927. On a 40-mile New York Central stretch between Stanley and Barrack, Ohio. Along that corridor, parallel rails cross flat ground beneath a row of dark poles and continue through blue dusk. The Ohio corridor falls behind. A single signal housing waits farther west, one dark lens above the rail. Under 49 CFR Part 236, a signal aspect is more than a pattern of color. It must indicate an action to be taken. Past the housing, The track enters the western rain again. One colored point remains beyond the sleepers, held low beneath blue-black, weather gathering near the coast. The routine U.S. fundamental indication, assigned to red, is stop. The last lamp stands beside the rain-wet steel beneath the coastal cloud. The railway remains beyond the glass. Rain thins against the window, and the pillow keeps its hollow beneath your head. You are a long way out tonight and still home.